Hello, sisters. Welcome to the Sacred Medicine Podcast, weaving powerful, soulful practices into functional medicine. Step into this beautiful space of devotion and explore everything from nurturing foods, rituals, sexuality, and awakening your innate sensuality. It is time to own your radiance. This is the Sacred Medicine Podcast. Hello and welcome back to another week of the Sacred Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Margaret Romero, and this week is part 2 of a discussion we had on toxic mold. And we are back again with Dr. Margaret Christensen. But this week, we are talking all about mold and how it is affecting hormones, especially in women. I mean, it does affect both men and women, but we're seeing such an influx in hormone issues in women. So you want to listen up because this is so important, especially for those women who are, they're having some maybe hot flashes or heavy periods or even experiencing some infertility. And that is most likely not the first thing you're thinking of. You're not thinking, it's mold, because it's certainly not the thought for most, if not all, conventional medicine doctors. And it's probably most likely not even something that your GYN is thinking about. Because if you're at a certain age, heavy periods could mean fibroids, they could mean so many things. Hot flashes, night sweats could be, okay, well, if you're in your late 40s or early 50s, it's seen. It's one of the symptoms of perimenopause and women who are, heading into early menopause. So we are talking today all about this, and it's really super fascinating how and what mold does to the body. I mean, we talked about this last week, and we talked about all the different ways and how it's showing up. But this week, it's amazing to me how the mycotoxins can actually affect hormones. And it's also affecting hormones in children, in growing teens. And, you've got these really painful periods. So what do most docs do? They'll put young teens on birth control. And it's not the thing that, if you're just this is a whole other discussion about teens going on birth control. And it's one thing if it's to prevent pregnancy. It's a completely different thing if you're just trying to control, heavy periods and painful periods. So, and I get it. Nobody wants to be in that much pain. It's horrible. It's a gift to maybe not go to school. You're constantly having to change your pad or tampon. And so I get it. And typically birth control pills will help. But let's look a little deeper here because there are other reasons for this. And, there's this huge toxic mold project. It's like a summit. And there's going to be over 40 different experts talking all about mold. Not only about how it's affecting the body, but also there are going to be experts there talking also about remediation. If you find mold in your home, what do you do? How do you deal with it? Do you need to move out? Do you need to leave everything behind? What's the deal? And how to, kind of finally, heal your body after it's been exposed to mold. So this is a reminder that it is a free 7-day access to this summit. So I'm definitely going to be there listening in, and it's going to be really, really amazing. So today's talk, all about hormones. We talk also about children who are getting recurrent ear infections, people who get recurrent sinus infections, sore throats, so many things that we see commonly that you just are like, oh yeah, okay, so yeah, he has another ear infection. He or she has another ear infection. It's kind of gets it every year type of thing. But we need to start looking a little bit deeper sometimes. And there are many reasons for things like that, or recurrent sinus infections. There's so many reasons. And sometimes recurrent sinus infections doesn't mean that you have to get your sinuses cleaned out and drilled out and whatever it is that they do to remove polyps and all sorts of things. Before you get to that, there are other things that could be done. And this is a whole other topic. But as an aside, sinus infections, chronic sinusitis, is linked to issues in your gut. You may have never heard anyone say this to you before, tell you that, but it's true. In functional medicine, it is true. So, and the more antibiotics you give someone with a sinus infection, the worse their gut issues become. So they're always on an antibiotic. And I see this so much, it's insane. But you know what? Let's leave that. I'm going to write this down because I'm going to talk about this, because it's not something that people talk about. I'm sure it has never been something that you've heard of from your healthcare provider. It's always like, oh, okay, you got green and you have pressure. Okay, well, let's put you on an antibiotic. And then, oh, it's back again 3 months later. Okay, antibiotic. Oh, it's back. Yeah, I know. It's kind of going around. Okay, another antibiotic. But, let me not go down that rabbit hole right now. But mold does create this issue as well. So without further ado, on to the show.
This week's guest is Dr. Margaret Christensen, and she was here talking about mold. And this is sort of like a part 2. Today, we're going to be talking about how mold affects hormones. Thank you so much for coming back on the show.
Well, thanks so much, Margaret. We've got the 2 Margarets here. That's great. Yeah. And, I'm an OBGYN by my original training. And so hormones are us is totally, that's a big area that I'd love to talk about.
Yes, I love hormones too. So yes, brief us on how mold affects hormones.
Okay, so when we're talking mold here, we're talking about toxic mold. I'm not talking about like allergen mold that's outside. We're talking about toxic mold exposure from water damaged buildings, which I understand you all just had a big storm on the East Coast. And all these flooded homes all around the country from different areas all create this kind of a big issue. When you have water damage, you end up growing molds often in damp sheetrock that produces a lot of what are called mycotoxins. Mm-hmm. And it's those mycotoxins that can have a hormonally disrupting effect.
And how does it do that? I mean, how is it impacting like that specific, we know it affects cognitive behavior, and it causes recurrent sinus infections and headaches and things like that. But how is it actually affecting the hormones?
Well, that's a great question. So it affects hormones in really 4 different ways. And let me just take you down through each way that hormone disruption that can happen. And before I get there, let me just talk about some of the symptoms that you can have because of toxic mold exposure. Sure. So these would include things like infertility. Even PCOS syndrome can certainly be way exacerbated by this and or triggered by it. Very heavy periods, bad PMS, even things like breast and uterine cancer can have toxic molds as an underlying trigger. And that's on the estrogen side of things. Then we can see disruption certainly in thyroid hormone and the thyroid gland itself. As well as major disruptions in the adrenal axis. So what we call the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis can all be disrupted. And there are, basically 4 different mechanisms of action where mold can impact those. So if you are, listening out there and you've had some of those symptoms. Oh, and by the way, night sweats, particularly night sweats that are happening and you're not in your late 40s, if they're happening earlier, and in men too. And we can also touch on men's hormones. So the first way that we can think about toxic mold disrupting hormones has to do with what we call hormone mimetic. So it actually mimics. There's different types of mycotoxins. So mold is the actual bacteria itself, the bacterium, the organism. It's not really bacteria. And it can produce mycotoxins. So mycotoxins themselves can look or act like or interact with receptors for different hormones. So for example, there is a mycotoxin that's called zearalenone. And that particular one has been known for many, many, many years to cause things like miscarriages and infertility in animals. You can see high levels of that in grains, but it's also produced in some of the molds that are in buildings. So zearalenone high levels, again, can create everything from bad PMS with breast tenderness and heavy periods to signaling uterine fibroids to grow, to contributing to leaky gut, which is part of what is behind if you have endometriosis. And again, just, kind of major infertility. So that is one way. This is this hormone mimetic way. And there are mycotoxins that interact with testosterone receptors and also with thyroid receptors. So that's one major way. The next way we think about has to do with the part of the brain that's called the limbic system. And the limbic system, Margaret, I don't know if are your viewers aware of what that is? Have anybody talked about that before?
No,
I
can explain that. What that
yeah.
is.
Okay, so the limbic system is what we would call the older reptile part of the brain that helps to control many of our body's systems, and it's composed of a number of different pieces. One piece is called the hypothalamus. That's the master regulatory center for hormones as well as many other bodily functions in the brain. So you have the hypothalamus, and then you have the amygdala. The amygdala is the fight or flight center of the brain. And that is what's interacting with your adrenal glands, telling you to make adrenaline or cortisol to get up and run or fight or freeze. That could be the other response. So you have the hypothalamus and the amygdala, and then you also have the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is the memory center of the brain and helps you remember if something is scary or toxic or, again, traumatic in your life. And all of these three parts of the limbic system are working together. So what's important to understand is that our olfactory nerve, that's your smelling nerve, goes from the back of your nose and sinuses directly into the limbic system in the brain. And it's feeding it information about our environment. It's trying to tell you, is your environment safe or not? Well, unfortunately, a lot of toxic mold creates inflammation in the olfactory nerve. And actually, these mycotoxins can dissolve cell membranes and really irritate that olfactory nerve. And it's sending those inflammatory signals and irritation directly into the hypothalamus, which then is part of what's controlling hormones. So that is one of the ways, again, that you can affect your HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, through inflammation coming from, for example, chronic sinus infections, and chronic allergies and congestion and inflammation if you've got a lot of sinuses. So that is one of the things that happens. And Margaret, what do people get when they have sinus infections and or any other infections?
Mucus.
How are they treated? Yeah, but how are they treated?
Yeah, antibiotics.
They're treated with antibiotics.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that leads me kind of into the third way that we see a lot of hormonal disruption is we know that one of the things that happens with antibiotics when you're taking them orally and or IV is that it disrupts the microbiome or the good guy bacteria in the intestines. And what a lot of people don't know, including a lot of my colleagues, is that the healthy microbiome and good bacteria are responsible for helping us to metabolize hormones that are supposed to be being excreted and moved out of the body, and helping to balance and help with our detoxification mechanisms. So when you've taken a lot of antibiotics and you've disrupted your normal microbiome and you get dysbiosis or an imbalance, or you get yeast or fungal overgrowth like candida, those themselves, for example, the candida can make mycotoxins themselves, which have hormonal disrupting properties. And some of the bad bacteria produce an enzyme that's called beta glucuronidase, kind of a big word. But that enzyme breaks down the estrogens that were supposed to be excreted and makes them loose and free again, and then they recirculate. So you can get recirculating estrogens in the gut because of a lot of antibiotic use. And then mycotoxins themselves disrupt the gut flora and can create a lot of gut issues. So if you have IBS or SIBO, that's small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or SIFO, small intestinal fungal overgrowth, all of those things can then disrupt hormone production. And on the upcoming Toxic Mold Project Summit, I have 3 different ladies at the leading edge of talking about gut issues and hormones, speaking to that issue. And again, how do we correct that? So that's the third way. That's one of the third ways that we can disrupt that.
I wanted
go ahead.
I just, going back to the first question about the symptoms, do you also see, aside from PMS and heavy periods, also amenorrhea, not getting a period?
Oh, sure, absolutely. So we can see definitely some infertility. Again, if you are impacting the hypothalamus enough, and particularly if you're underweight, then amenorrhea can definitely be triggered. And that's a good question. Yeah. So really, frankly, the whole spectrum of hormonal disruption that we see, that I would see as a gynecologist, mold mycotoxins and antibiotics play a huge role in those. So we've talked about the hormone mimetic way that mycotoxins can disrupt. We've talked about direct inflammation in the limbic system and hypothalamus from breathing in the mycotoxins through the olfactory nerve. And then we've talked about disruption of the microbiome and how that impacts hormone systems. And then we talk about cortisol and or adrenal distress. So, again, a lot of times when folks have had toxic mold exposure, they just don't feel good. It also can create a lot of anxiety. Again, you're inflaming the amygdala portion of the limbic system, which is what's dumping adrenaline and triggering that fight or flight sensation. So, you got a lot of anxiety going on. You're disrupting your production of cortisol and adrenaline. And over time, particularly, your ability to produce cortisol when you need it may become compromised. Initially, you get overproduction of cortisol, and that can lead to things like severe sugar cravings and sugar imbalances and insulin imbalances and weight gain. That's a big one. And I can come back and talk about weight gain too, because that's a huge, huge piece. Weight gain that happens just out of the blue, and you're gaining 30 pounds over 3 or 4 months, that's mold until proven otherwise in my book. Again, it's that disruption in the adrenal system and the cortisol that can happen because of all the stressors of the exposures and the suppression of the immune system on one hand, and overactivation of, there's 2 different parts of the immune system. So we get suppression of the innate immune system and then overactivation of the adaptive. And again, that is the body's big stress response, which again disrupts hormones. And and certainly if you're not sleeping, that's another big one.
Sure. Yes, that was great. I'm hoping that, I think you talked about this in somewhat layman's terms, so I think most people would understand it. And so, I mean, can we see, or have you seen sort of these? I mean, it's hard to know when someone's young and live in a home, maybe they're in their 20s or in their late teens, but they've sort of lived in a moldy home for many, many, many years, and they have PMS, they have heavy periods, tender breasts, and it's just, to them or to their GYN, it's just sort of a normal thing. How do we distinguish whether or not, and they don't know anything about mold, they don't see it, they don't smell it. When would somebody sort of jump into that and say, okay, this may be mold related? Because it's sort of hard to know if most people complain of PMS or heavy periods, 20s or 30s.
Sure. And that's a great question. Well, first of all, is having a high index of suspicion. And one of the reasons that I've put together the Toxic Mold Project is because it is such a common problem underlying many different expressions of diseases, but hormonal is a big thing. 50% of houses have had some water damage and 60% of commercial buildings. So again, for your listeners, one of the simple things that you can do is you can go online to survivingmold.com and take an online visual contrast sensitivity test, or a VCS test. That one's $15. I think there's a free one too. Maybe it's vcstest.com. So that's something. So I just want folks to have a high index of suspicion. If you've had a history of having had a lot of upper respiratory infections from the time you were a little kid, for example, ear infections, strep throats, tonsillitis, bronchitis, pneumonia. If you have if that's in your history, then there's a high likelihood that there was an exposure that happened. Again, dorm rooms are notorious. Cheap apartments, and college apartments, again, are notorious for that. And so if you're having kind of a chronic cough, if you have, besides the, hormonal system or PMS symptoms, if you're having recurrent headaches a lot, if you have just this fatigue sensation a lot, if you're having any weird neurological conditions like tremors, and like I said, if you're having any hot flashes or night sweats, that's another sign that there may be a toxic mold component to this.
And so let's say somebody maybe does a mold test of their home, or they get those agar plates and looks, it's positive. And, let's say they move, they decide, or they find it and they clean it up, or they decide to move. How long does it take to actually rehab the hormonal system when they've had exposure for a long time?
Well, part of that, it kind of depends on how long the exposure's been, how long they've been sick, and then what are you doing to help remediate the body. So we have to remediate where the home or the building. And the other point I want to make here is that oftentimes it's not the first mold exposure that's causing the problem. If you understand that these mycotoxins are fat soluble, that means they get into your body and they stay in the fat and they accumulate over time. So you may have been, like myself, exposed growing up in, I've got the hiccups now, growing up in houses that have, again, basements that are musty or moldy. And then we lived in a number of different places that had some, a leak here, a leak there. Right. Over time, again, I went off to college, lived in a dorm that was super old, and then moved into, a duplex that was really super old. And I yanked up all the carpet that was probably, 20 or 30 years old. And I coughed for 4 months after that. Yeah. So anyway, it's this accumulation over time. And then it may be that last place that you're living or working in that has built things up. So your question was, how long does it take? Well, I mean, I can turn somebody around in 3 months, or it may take a whole year, again, depending on what the other issues are. So I think it's important to understand how to create hormonal balance.
Sure. Okay. And so let's say somebody has, let's say they're in their late 40s, they're getting some hot flashes, maybe some really heavy periods. They suspect possibly some fibroids, a transvaginal ultrasound hasn't been done yet. And they start to get on, let's just say, hormonal HRT. And they are put on estrogen and progesterone, maybe some testosterone as well. Is something like that, obviously it's not going to get rid of the mycotoxin, but it may temporarily help with the symptoms. Have you ever seen someone who gets on HRT, hormone replacement therapy, and then and they continue to live in the home, they have mold exposure still every day. Have you seen this happen, and what happens to them? Are there, perimenopausal symptoms? Do they worsen? Do they improve significantly with HRT? Like, what have you seen?
Well, that's a good question, and it kind of could be all over the board. First of all, if you have really significant adrenal fatigue, I don't really particularly like that terminology, but a lot of people have heard that. But when your body is pretty exhausted, then having some hormonal support can be helpful. The problem is that a lot of folks are taking hormones, and a lot of prescribers are prescribing it without first cleaning up somebody's gut and somebody's liver. Because you want to do those two things, because that's really what's impacting hormonal production. So if you have somebody who's got a lot of dysbiosis, who's got bad IBS, who maybe is missing their gallbladder, or they've got gallbladder sludge, or they've been on a lot of different medications that are impacting their liver and their gallbladder. They take a lot of Tylenol. They've taken a lot of ibuprofen in their life. They've been on a lot of antibiotics. And you start giving that person who's having a lot of symptoms, hormone replacement therapy, particularly with synthetic hormones. Yes, you can make them worse. You can make, and they can gain a lot of weight. You can see a lot of, again, breast tenderness and swelling, fluid retention. So I think it's absolutely imperative for anyone doing any kind of hormone replacement to first make sure that they've done a gut repair protocol, and that they've worked on really upregulating their detoxification mechanisms, particularly their liver enzymes.
Got it. Right, because most hormones have to, they're metabolized by the liver.
Right, and so by the liver and also the gut. And let me just go back to premenopausal women. Again, those who are having very irregular periods, or PCOS, or heavy periods, all of that. Oftentimes, again, they have estrogen dominance, and the hormones, the mycotoxins themselves can be hormone mimetic. So again, that can worsen that estrogen dominance. They're going to benefit from using some natural progesterone, particularly in the second half of the menstrual cycle. And that is going to help balance that excess of estrogen and can help with symptomatology. But again, at the same time, you want to really kind of clean up the gut. And one of the reasons that we put people on a paleo diet that is very plant-based is because lots of grains have mold mycotoxins in them. Mm-hmm. And so you can be exacerbating your hormonal disruption by consuming molds in your foods. And grains are the big culprit. Corn has something in it called fumonisin. And wheat can have lots of different ones, aflatoxins, ochratoxins. And then sugar, again, feeds and inflames all of that. And you've probably had people talk about before about insulin resistance and what happens when you have insulin, and what happens to your hormones and to your estrogen and testosterone.
Right. Yes. I just wanted to bring up something about, have nothing to do with the paleo diet, but
right.
Coffee contains lots of mold in it as well.
Yes.
And I know.
As does black tea.
Yes. And so there are certainly mold-free coffee out there. I know Bulletproof has one. There's one called Purity Coffee that is also mold-free. Mm-hmm. Do you know of any others?
Those are the two I'm aware of. I have Dave Asbury, who is the founder of the Bulletproof executive, and Bulletproof is he got his start because of toxic mold, and so I have him speaking to the men's issues and the men's hormones on the Mold Summit. So.
Oh, great! I'm looking forward to that. Okay, so this is great. So women who are having hormonal issues, there's so many women that have hormonal issues and thyroid problems and adrenal fatigue, adrenal issues, and actually, unbeknownst to them, they have adrenal problems. It looks like thyroid, and they're just sort of blindly put on thyroid medication without having adrenals checked first.
Yeah.
Which is like the biggest mistake ever by conventional.
Absolutely. Totally.
Yeah. So I can see how anyone going to a conventional medicine doc with any type of hormonal issues, thyroid problems, seeing an endocrinologist is just going to be they're not even going to, a mold will never be addressed.
Right.
And sadly, and it's really good to know, because I think a lot of women listening will now sort of wonder about it. And I know we talked a little bit about this in the last episode, but I think seeing either a functional medicine practitioner or a naturopath who has access to functional testing, particularly urine tests that will test for mold. But this is not your run-of-the-mill, go to your doctor, leave a urine sample. That won't...
That's not going to pick it up. No.
There's a special lab that does this in particular. So for anyone listening, if you have or suspect or you know that you have mold and you've suddenly started getting some hormonal problems, then certainly find a practitioner that will work with you. It's certainly not going to be a conventional medicine doc, and it definitely won't be your endocrinologist. So
this is true.
I encourage you to find someone, get the test done, and see what it shows, and then we can start healing the mold. And then your hormones will they could come back, but it may need help.
Oh yeah, no, I've had women who've had premature ovarian failure because of toxic mold exposure. And, we get them on binders. We use very specific kind of protocols of, again, how to heal the gut, how to upregulate the liver, and then how to start binding and pulling out the toxins out of you. And you can do everything from taking, again, you need to take some binders like charcoal, clay, chlorella. We have a combo that I use for that, along with doing things like sweating and Epsom salt baths, lymphatic drainage. Those are all ways to help mobilize the mold out of your system, along with a really super clean diet, organic. Again, you want to kind of decrease the whole body burden. And I'm sure you've talked about the hormonal disrupting effects of a lot of personal care products that we use, whether it's makeup or laundry detergent and things in our home. So we want to clean all of that up. And the other thing you can do is get a good air filter, a HEPA air filter to put in your bedroom so you're sleeping with clean air.
Yeah, absolutely. Just the other day, I was at the store sort of looking at, there was a whole bunch of lipsticks, and I was so curious to see the ingredients. So I pulled the ingredient, it's like underneath it's right on the box that it's in. And you wouldn't believe how many times it said aluminum.
Yes.
And it just contains so many toxic metals. And then it's right on your lips. So you're consuming them all day long. And you know how many times women just reapply all day?
Yeah.
It's crazy. And so if you think you don't have a heavy metal toxicity, I know we're not talking about that today.
But heavy metals and toxic molds do some very similar things in terms of both get inside cell membranes and mitochondrial membranes and disrupt energy production and disrupt flow of nutrients and oxygen and toxins in and out of the cells. So particularly if you've got both of those things going on, as well as, again, just generalized pesticide exposure and all the crap that we deal with in our water and our air. That's why, I think it behooves everybody to take some binders every day.
Right. And somehow get into an infrared sauna.
Yes.
I have one of those mats that I lay on every night, even though it's the middle of summer. Something to just sweat. And it's also really easy to do, the dry brush.
Dry brushing, loofah. Again, hot Epsom salt baths where you're really sweating, put 3 cups of salts in, maybe a cup of baking soda in that with that, throw in some essential oils. Those are all things that are super helpful. And again, we use binders and, I'll use coffee enemas in folks too to help mobilize stuff. You have to be careful with that. You can't overdo that. But
sure.
Yeah, there's a lot of great ways that, and then when you're mobilizing all this stuff and you're cleaning up your liver and you're cleaning up your gut and you've got good probiotics and you're eating a diet that supports a lot of good hormone production. And I will mention how important some good fats are for hormone production and having healthy cell membranes. So particularly the kind of fats that are found in raw seeds, like pumpkin seeds and sunflower seeds and chia seeds and hemp seeds and flax seeds. These are linoleic acid and linolenic acid, some of the good omega-6s that we don't get enough of. And unfortunately, most of the oils that are found in our diet and, on the shelf at the grocery store have been superheated. And so that's disrupting those good oils. Those good oils are really, really important for helping create healthy cell membranes, as well as providing the precursors or the substrates to create good, healthy hormones. And by the way, cholesterol, all hormones are made from cholesterol. So you don't want a super low cholesterol.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's been bought and paid for by the pharmaceutical industry, that message.
Right. So I'm sorry, you said hemp seeds, flax seeds. Did you say sesame seeds?
Yeah, hemp seeds, flax seeds. Yeah, you can do sesame seeds too, chia seeds, but you want raw, not heated. And it's even better. You can soak all of those in some water, and I add some caps of something called E-Lite, which is electrolyte solution to that, and then you can zap it up and like in a blender and make a seed cream, and kind of freeze that and use that in things like smoothies and all that. But there's so I have a whole discussion about that in the Toxic Mold Project with Dr. Kelly McCann in terms of lipid membrane therapy to help heal that, and that heals hormones. And I don't know if you've ever had Marcel Pick on. Marcel is a nurse practitioner. She was the original founder of Women to Women, and she has her own podcast and everything now. And she also teaches with me at the Institute for Functional Medicine on women's hormones. But Marcel and I discuss again the hormonal impact, and also let's bring up adverse childhood events, ACEs. Adverse childhood events is something also that's very important to recognize in terms of disrupting hormones. Mm-hmm. And and it's very interesting too when growing up in moldy houses, the divorce rate is very high because everybody is sick and irritable. And I believe in our last podcast with you, I talked about some of the psychiatric manifestations of toxic mold. So, and then also very interesting addiction, because mold exposure, toxic mold can create so much anxiety and brain inflammation and depression and a lot of bipolar and mood swings. You have a lot of craziness going on, and then a lot of people self-medicating with alcohol, and or sugar, and or drugs of other sorts. And that again can lead to a lot of disrupted behaviors. And if you grow up in an alcoholic family system, or mold rage is definitely something that happens with again, men tend to get a lot more irritability with this, but you can see really big mood swings, a lot of anger. And if you're dealing with that, and particularly as a little kid and you're growing up, walking around on eggshells, or you've witnessed abuse, or been in an alcoholic family system or neglected, all of that is impacting your limbic system. Right. And your memory, and the memory centers in the limbic system, and the amygdala in the fight-flight response, and it's impacted your hypothalamus. So you have that combination along with chronic illness or recurrent infections or whatever, and that's a lot of the folks that we see.
That's amazing. Yes, we did talk about that, but we didn't talk about mold rage, which is that's new to me. What about depression, like severe depression?
Oh, huge. Severe depression, yeah, can be a big part of it, again, because there is so much neuroinflammation going on. And again, it's impacting the mitochondria. So depending on your genetics and your pre-existing circumstances, depends on how this may show up for you. So we've, this time talked a lot about, again, hormonal disruptions. Before, we talked about a lot of neuropsychiatric problems and in neurological long-term issues. Then you can have all kinds of autoimmune issues being triggered, and it just depends on your genetics. So again, whether you're talking about Hashimoto's or Crohn's disease or eczema, psoriasis, rheumatoid arthritis, and systemic lupus, all of those things, mold significantly impacts the immune system, both the innate immune system suppressing it, so it doesn't go after viruses and bacteria and cancer cells, and the adaptive immune system, which is what produces all the antibodies and the cytokines. Sure. And so I mean, again, you can see lots of different things, and with children, you see a lot of recurrent upper respiratory infections, ear infections, tonsils, strep throats, pneumonitis, eczema, and psoriasis. So again, if you have a lot of different family members who are not well, then that's one of the first things I think about.
Sure, absolutely. So tell us a little bit about the Toxic Mold Summit that's coming up.
Well, sure. The toxicmoldproject.com, and I'm sure you've got a link in your podcast notes. It's free online in August 17th through 23rd, but even if you listen to this afterwards, it's still available. And I have over 40 different interviews talking about all of the different, manifestations of this, and then what to do. How do you go about cleaning it up out of your body, and also, again, addressing your home? So I cover the entire gamut of symptoms that we see, and then what to do about it.
That's amazing. I can't believe, 40 people with just discussing so many variety of different topics under mold. I mean, mold has been such an interest for me, so I can't wait to.
Yeah, well, and again, if for those of you who are following you, if you follow some of the names in functional medicine, though, Dr. Mark Hyman is one of my guests. He almost died from toxic mold exposure 4 years ago. Amy Myers, who's very big in Hashimoto's and autoimmune issues. She got super sick, and many of us got into functional medicine because of mold toxicity. Dr. Terry Walls of the Walls Protocol, she's a doc who had severe multiple sclerosis and MS, and how, again, she reversed that with functional medicine principles. She's on there. Dr. Tom O'Brien talking about leaky brains. So I've got psychiatrist Mary Ackerley speaking to the psychiatric aspects. So I've really got the whole thing covered. And if you have sinus infections, oh my gosh, please listen to Dr. Donald Dennis, because we have an amazing discussion on sinuses.
Amazing. I didn't know that Dr. Hyman had mold toxicity.
Oh yeah, really badly. Yeah.
4 years ago. I heard about something. Wait, is this? Yeah. No, there was something he has always spoken about, that he was very ill, but I thought that was like 15.
Yeah. That was his his original exposures, and it was heavy metals and mercury, and it was probably some mold back then too. And that's the other thing, that again, a lot of times you get priming in your earlier years, and then you get an exposure, and that's just that's what breaks the camel's back. It's what spills the bucket over. And but the good news is there's a lot you can do with just diet and nutrients, and cleaning up the air quality and your food quality and your water quality, that as well as working on your mind and working with your limbic system, and doing some limbic retraining and meditation, and really work on calming and having hope, laughter, gratitude. Those are all good things.
Oh yeah. Super, super important. Okay, so we are going to link all of this. I also have a link on my Instagram. I put a post up last week, and so the link is on my link tree. If anyone's listening, and if you're following me on Instagram, it's on there. It's also on Facebook as well.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Margaret.
Yeah, no, this is great. I learned so much. I knew that it affected it, but I didn't know to this degree. And so what a helpful, discussion. And the majority of my listeners are women. So I think it's eye-opening, and hopefully they can also join in this free, discussion that we're going to be. So that's, is it a week? It's 5 days long.
It's 7 days long. But again, it's available now, the access, and it's free to watch, but there's a lot of material. Most people can't take a whole week and, sit down and watch, 5 to 6 hours a day of stuff. So sure. It's also available for purchase, and you can just keep it. And there's a lot of really great bonus materials, and there's some great free downloads too, including an ebook on, it's called Moldy Now What? Again, just kind of taking you through all the different steps.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
All of this with us today. I know it's going to help a lot of women that are listening.
Sounds great.
And
thanks.
Good luck on the project. And I'm looking forward to listening in.
Okay. Thanks, Margaret.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, I don't know about you, but my mind was blown with all of the specifics on how mold actually can completely transform and change your hormones. So grateful to Dr. Christensen for sharing her wisdom and knowledge today. If you want to learn more about her or the Toxic Mold Project and to sign up for free, all the information will be in the show notes. It'll also be, if you have iTunes, it'll be all below the actual podcast. You'll see the full description and all the links in there as well. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this conversation, and I will see you all at the Toxic Mold Project Summit. I am so excited for it. I will be listening to it on my way to work every single day and on my way home. So have a great night, and I'll speak to you all next week. Bye for now.